That you're talking about traumas.
Yes.
Tell me about your definition of traumas and why it's so important to work on it. Why it's so? As I understood, the trauma is its kind of core issue.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Look, when you start looking at the definition of what trauma is, you can look at the dictionary definition and say, okay, there's one established perfect description for it. But what I find when I work with my students and my clients is that we all have different definitions of what trauma is. For example, what's traumatic for me could be absolutely just a normal incident to you, and what's traumatic to you could be something that was just something that I could just brush off quite easily. So it's quite hard to say what a trauma is. But for me, what a trauma really is something that you remember. It's something that is hard to just let go of. It's something that really shapes your life in quite a negative way. And sometimes what people say is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, I have a little bit of a different perspective on that, because what I feel what happens is that the more trauma people experience, the harder they try to fight to overcome it, and the more aggressive they can either become, like it's a complete overcompensation, or people become completely desensitized and they disassociate from that trauma, which means that they disassociate from their reality, they disassociate from their emotions, and it's almost like you become like a bit of a walking zombie, and you try, it really is like that. You learn to feel comfortable feeling uncomfortable. So when we look at trauma during my seminars, and what I do is, for example, the springbok. Let's have a look at the springbok in South Africa. You know, it's running around, it's grazing, it's having a really great time, and then suddenly a lion starts chasing it. And the springbok just gets away and it escapes. It nearly died, but it escapes. And what happens is, with the springbok, it starts shaking. Just for a few seconds, it starts shaking, and then it starts eating the grass like nothing happened.
I saw this on Discovery.
Yes, it's like nothing happened. It's like, oh, I didn't just lose my life. Everything's fine. It's eating the grass and it's feeling perfectly calm, back to its normal state. But the memory of a lion is dangerous is still there. But the trauma cycle has completed. The adrenaline, everything has completed. Now, what happens is, what I find with humans is that we also have a natural healing ability to complete trauma. Because of so much suppression that happened in the ancestry, and being, like for example, crying. Crying is a really great way of expressing our trauma and trying to complete a trauma cycle. But, you know, what happens when you cry? Sometimes people get smacked, they get slapped as a child, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not appropriate, but
suppressing yourself.
Exactly, suppressing yourself because you get either yelled at. So what happens is that need, that ability to try to complete that trauma cycle becomes suppressed, and the trauma becomes anchored in. So what happens is, one trauma after another starts stacking up, and what happens is that this trauma, even though this trauma tries to complete itself, it can't. And it starts to surface in ways of depression, anxiety, panic attacks, chronic fatigue. You know, we all have different ways of how we try to process this trauma. But because we don't fully complete that trauma cycle,
or defends ourselves from the same trauma.
Absolutely, like a fear of it happening again. So we're holding on to that trauma as a reminder of what it feels like, so that it wouldn't happen again. But again, then that sabotages you from expanding. It sabotages your personal growth, because you're keeping yourself small. You're holding back because of that fear of what will happen if I let go of this trauma. If I let go of this trauma, it might happen again. You know, I'm sure you can relate to that, because that's something, that's definitely something that I related to, and what I found in my healing journey was that fear of letting go of trauma, because if I do, then oh my goodness, it might happen again. But when that trauma really generally heals, that fear of it coming back doesn't even cross your mind.
Like, you have the memory
is there, you feel at peace with what happened, and you can just continue your life as normal.
Did I understand you right, that it's about the stress can be, any stress can be the trauma, right?
Of course. I mean, like for example, if you had quite a stressful day at work, or you got yelled at by your boss, for some people that can actually be quite traumatic. And for me, that would be stressful, for example. But for someone who's very highly sensitive, that can be quite a traumatic experience for them, depending on how much they've been through during their childhood. Like, trauma can either make you desensitized or oversensitive. So,
nice.
you know, you have one extreme to the other. Like it's very rare that you have a middle ground, you know. With people who become desensitized to it, it just becomes a normal way of life. It's like being abused becomes a lifestyle. It becomes normal and it becomes acceptable. And for people who's oversensitive, often overreact to circumstances and situations by being overly defensive, always isolating themselves, or maybe being very over analytical of things that's being said to them because they're always looking for an attack. Some people always being ready for a fight when there's no fight there because they're so ready to defend themselves. But again, that brings you back to the childhood, and it depends on what your experiences were there and how you cope with that trauma during your childhood and the stress that was there. And another very important point is also how did you see your mother cope with stress? How did you see your father cope with stress? Or the main caretaker that was mostly around you. In some places, like for example here in Russia, that would be the grandmother. How did grandma cope with stress? Because you copy that, you learn from that. Because as a child, you're like a sponge. You absorb everything around you. You watch people's behaviors. You really try to see how people cope with circumstances.
How to survive.
That's it, and you copy that. So there can be so many different angles to that, and that's why I'm quite cautious of how I would say what is my definition of trauma, because again, bringing it back to what I said earlier, what could be traumatic for me might not be traumatic for you.
Yeah,
so
for sure, I can even you didn't notice.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, exactly. So that's why I often refer to stress or challenging circumstances. But during the seminars, I do prefer to use the word trauma because it really gets people to think, hang on, what was really traumatic for me and what was stressful? It just helps them to really define what could it be that was affecting me. Like what was stressful? Yes, of course you need to address that, but what was really traumatic for you? And that's what's important. So the definition, it can have so many different meanings.